Morning, everybody. I'd like to do another video in my series on ministerial integrity. This is video 421, and the exhortation is summarized in just a little phrase which says, "Be joyful in suffering." Be joyful in suffering. You know, when Christ described the suffering that the disciples would face, he said something interesting about how they would face the suffering. First, in the Sermon on the Mount, Christ describes the experiences and the characteristics of those whom God describes as the blessed. And then he says something personal to his listeners. He says in verse 11, "Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake." And then he describes how they should respond to that. Let's just think about that for a minute. They're going to revile you. They're going to absolutely express the hatred that's within their hearts towards you. That's what they're going to do. And not only that, but they're going to persecute you. Now, persecution is about how the enemies of the people of God manipulate and use the systems and the circumstances and the things that they can do at their disposal against you. That's what persecution is. He says they will revile you and they will persecute you and they will say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Got that? It's not just because of you. It's not because they don't like you. They're doing it because it's against Christ. You are the living embodiment of Christ to them. And they hate him without a cause. And they're going to spew out all of their venom on you. Now then. And then he describes how they are going to then respond to that. And he says this. He says, "Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets that were before you." How a minister of the gospel reacts to the reviling of wicked men and the persecution and the slander, the false slander, says so much about who he is. He says, rejoice. Ministers are to be very happy in God and to glorify his name in the sheer joy of suffering. In case you've missed what it means, he goes on, he says, "And be exceeding glad." In case you don't know what rejoice means, he says, be exceeding glad. How or why would anyone react like this? Christ explains why. Because great is your reward in heaven. There is a reward for those who stand with Christ in the battles of this life. And standing with Christ brings a great reward. And you're in great company. The prophets of old suffered horrendously for their stand with God. Now, what was this to be true for Christians too? Absolutely. It was. And in fact, in the letter to the Philippians, Paul writes in chapter 4, verse 4, he says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say rejoice." In good times, they were to rejoice. In bad times, they were to rejoice. They were to rejoice always. And again, I say, rejoice. Now, the minister of the gospel learns how to rejoice in very difficult times. That's what he does. Now, let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1. I've got a little passage here to read for you. It's a little bit long, a little bit convoluted, but nevertheless, We're just going to read it through. Maybe you could look at it more in depth later. He says, "Blessed be to God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforteth us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble, by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted of God." Now let me ask you something. Why is it that you have tribulation in your life? Why is it that you're going to have difficulties? It's so that you're the one that's able to comfort those who also go through the same things. That's the purpose of it. Why do you have difficulties? So that you can comfort people who face difficulties. Why do people slander you? So that you will know what it's like when your fellow brother and sister is slandered for the name of Christ. That's why. For as the suffering of Christ abounds in us, so our consolation also abounds by Christ. So what he's saying is, just as the suffering that you have for Christ grows, so the comfort that God gives you grows. And whether we be afflicted, it is for your consolation and salvation, which is effectual in the enduring of the same sufferings which we also suffer. And whether we be comforted, it is for your consolation and salvation. And our hope for you is steadfast, knowing that as you are partakers of the sufferings, so you also of the consolation. So he's saying, listen, the sufferings that you're going to put up with, the sufferings that you're going to endure, okay, he said they are in direct proportion to the comfort that God will give. How are you going to face it? God will enable you to face it. Okay, let's read on. He says, "For we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our trouble, which came to us in Asia, and we were pressed out of measure, above our strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life. But we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raiseth the dead." He says, listen now, we were in such a situation in Asia in which we literally had the sentence of death resting upon us every day. We didn't know at any point in the day whether we'd ever see the end of the day. And we didn't know whether every single night we might never see the morning again. Right? And we had this so that we wouldn't trust in ourselves, but we would trust in God, who even if we die would be able to raise us from the dead. That's why. Who delivers us from so great a death, and does deliver, in whom we trust that he will also deliver us. You also helping together by prayer for us, that for the gift bestowed upon us by the means of many persons, thanks may be given by many on our behalf. Wow. I think it was Martin Luther that said, there are two things that make a man of God: prayer and suffering. Prayer and suffering. It's one thing to be a man of prayer. It's something else to suffer. In the forge of suffering, we learn what it is to trust in God and to rejoice in the Lord in spite of everything. The minister of the gospel never lets things get him down or be over sad. He must be like David, who encourages himself in the Lord. The minister of the gospel must learn to rejoice in the Lord. Well, we look forward to catching up with you on our next session, and we wish you every blessing. Bye for now.